Well, welcome everybody. I hope that you had okay travel both by car and by foot. That ice is very dangerous outside, so I do invite you to take caution and care when you leave. My husband, Paul, had an experience last night with a friend who ended up in the ER with a severe concussion. So just take care with your steps and make sure that you're aware of where you're going. So good morning. Welcome everybody. Today we begin a series of 4 sessions in this particular time frame on religious art. As you know, the congregation asked the Stepping Out in Faith Committee, the home group, to think about the stained glass windows in the sanctuary. And the Stepping Out in Faith home group is going to sort of take up this conversation, I think, in a variety of ways in the coming weeks and months. And all of these inputs will sort of help to inform the process and inform this gathering information stage of the process. So one of the things that the group is going to do with the help of Carol Johnson, our archivist, volunteer archivist in the congregation, is to find out more about the history of the windows themselves. You know, we know a little bit about the windows. We know more about the front window in the sanctuary, the abstract piece at the front of the sanctuary, because it was, of course, a later stained glass piece, so we have a little bit more information. But we're going to gather information with Carol's help and with others along the way. So we're going to look at the windows themselves. We're going to learn about their history. We're going to look at the current status of the health of the windows, knowing that they need some work themselves. We're going to host these conversations as a series of conversations to have the congregation participate in. And today we're going to talk about stained glass as an art form. We're really happy to have John Sandy, our next door neighbor, resident expert, to talk with us a little bit about the art form of stained glass. And we are also going to have a theologian talk about sacred art and theology next week. The third week, we'll have the iconographer who did the majority of the project for the Evangelical Lutheran Church, or excuse me, Evangelical Lutheran Book of Worship, our new ELW. So he'll be with us the third week, and then the fourth week, we're going to sort of see how the 3 weeks go and sort of see what we need to do with that fourth week. So we'll take it step by step. We hope that these forums will allow us to learn more about stained glass as an art form, learn more about the history of our own stained glass in the building, and have small group conversations about art and theology and how images shape us and how theology shapes images. And we hope that it'll be a really good experience for all of us to have with one another. Knowing that this particular time doesn't often work well for many of our young parents, we will also host a conversation at a time, usually it's around 8:30 p.m. for our young parents. That is a time where they like to meet online. So while when they put their kids to bed, we will also give them the opportunity to have some conversation about art as well. Stepping Out in Faith home group, we've said this, and Mike in his presentation said this previously, but it's made up of both members of the English-speaking congregation and the Swahili-speaking congregation. So another input into the process will be meeting with the leadership team of the Minnesota Swahili Christian congregation to talk with them about art and culture and images. So that'll be a really wonderful experience. As you know, we've shared this building for 20 years. with them. And one of our commitments in this next phase of our life together is to really treat the building as a shared asset, that we share an asset that is on Dakota ground, and we want to be mutual in that experience of sharing. So that's one other input into the process. I think that's as far as we are at this very moment. And as I was thinking about today's conversation, a few reminders. I say this in premarital counseling all the time, that I statements are our best friend. So if you have something that you'd like to share, I do invite you to use I statements. That will sort of embody the health and graciousness of the community that we're after. And then also, what I'm doing in this process is becoming more self-reflective of the biases that I bring into any space. So as I was thinking about this particular conversation in congregational life, a few of the sort of spectrums that came to my mind were this. How do we understand the church? So think about how you understand the church. Is it constantly in flux, or does it stand the test of time? Now, I understand these are far too simplistic, and you probably land somewhere along that spectrum, but be aware of your understanding of the church. Our understanding of art, does it speak for a time, or is it preserved for all time? And where do you fall along that spectrum? What about your relationship to the built world? Does stuff really matter to you? Or are you more of a Marie Kondo type? And where do you fall on that spectrum? How has this particular building connected to your life? Has it functioned like home, or has it never quite felt like home? Where do you fall on that spectrum? And then another spectrum that I was thinking about is, what's your understanding of change? Does change feel to you like it nullifies the past, or does change build on the past? All of those are too simplistic. I totally understand that. But just sort of be self-reflective as to where you fall on those spectrums as we have these conversations. It is with great joy that I have the opportunity to introduce John Sandy. John has become a friend. A neighbor. We have spent lots of time together these past 2 years, and John has been a wonderful asset for this community. John and his wife Zoe, are co-owners of Glass Endeavors right next door, one of the few buildings that survived the fires of 2020, and they are about to retire. So we give thanks for the gifts that they have offered to this community in these past years. John, they live not too far away. They'll still be around, and they have a friend who is going to sort of take over the stained glass portion of their business. It won't be in Glass Endeavors. That building is under purchase agreement, at least, with Uncle, I always forget the last name, Hugo, thank you, Uncle Hugo, who, it's a bookstore, and Moon Palace is just overjoyed that Uncle Hugo's will be moving into the neighborhood. It'll sort of become a book mecca for the Twin Cities metro area. So we're really, really thankful for their thoughtfulness in finding a new business owner for that building. So without further ado, John, Sandy, thank you so much for being here. We're so grateful.
Hello, I'm John Sandy from Glass Endeavors. My wife and I actually have a background in fine arts, so we weren't in stained glass right away. We started doing stained glass about in 1981 or so. But it was a fairly smooth transition from doing painting and drawing to doing stained glass. So it was one of those things that we enjoyed, and like I was telling Ingrid earlier, it was something I really enjoyed sharing with people so that they would understand how to be more creative and secure within themselves when it comes to their creativity. I wanted to thank Ingrid and Holy Trinity and Nolan, who has been very helpful to us too. Holy Trinity has been a great resource for us. It's been a fantastic neighbor. I was just telling Ingrid earlier, in 2016, I broke my leg, and so Nolan picked up the slack, and he was helping with snow blowing and stuff. So it was just fantastic. Kind of old school neighbors. I really, really appreciated it. So we've been teaching stained glass, and since we came out of an art historical or fine art background, we've been involved in the process of making art and making glass for a long time. And so one of my jobs here today is to explain how all that works. So to begin with the art portion of the piece, and I'll hopefully get around to the stained glass. All humans are born with the innate ability to understand what art is. It doesn't matter what part of the planet you were born on. You could be born in the Amazon, you could be born in Alaska, it doesn't matter. All humans understand the visual vocabulary of art. You may not be able to articulate it, and that's what art historians do. That's what people like me do when I go to school. I understand on a deeper level how to articulate what those principles are, but you don't need to do that. When you find that you have an opinion about something, you'll look at a piece of artwork, you'll say, oh, I like it, or no, I don't like it. That's because you understand the visual vocabulary. It's a nonverbal form of communication. And this nonverbal form of communication also has vocabulary, and the vocabulary is universal. It's universally human. And so ever since we've been living as humans in caves for a few 100,000 years and scrawling things on cave walls with a burned stick, we all have understood what those images meant. And usually the images that we decided to depict were images that were important to us and something that we wanted to communicate to others. So fast forward to the 1800s. Well, and actually I should go back a little bit. Stained glass has been around for about 1,000 years. That's about it, but it comes out of the tradition of other graphic arts like painting and drawing and printmaking. And again, you have to keep in mind when you're looking at artwork, that artwork is a communication from one human to another. Artwork is extremely abstract. When you look at something that's figurative, something that you can see images in the work with, if you look at that and understand, that's a person, you may be more emotionally attached to that, may like that better. When you look at an abstract piece, then you're going to say, maybe, I'm not as attracted to that because I can't really understand what I'm looking at. But if you can calm that down a little bit and look at it on a more open basis, you'll understand that you're still reacting emotionally to lines and color and movement within the piece. Abstract art and visually representational art, photographic representation, they're all exactly the same. They use exactly the same visual vocabularies. That's light to dark, cool to warm, motion through the piece. It's just that the subject matter varies. So the subject matter in an abstract piece is really just how shapes and lines and colors work together. In a figurative piece, it's that plus the subject matter has changed a little bit where it's more recognizable. But to give you an idea of how abstract art really is, in the early days of photography, photographs and cameras were brought to peoples in the world that were very untechnological. They'd never seen a camera before. They might just be hunting with bows and arrows. And after photographing those people and their loved ones, and then developing the photograph that day, once the image was given to the people to look at, they would pick the photograph up and then look at it and wouldn't understand how they were actually supposed to look at this flat thing. And they couldn't recognize the people in it. And it's because their brains weren't set up to interpret that kind of subject matter, that kind of photorealism. I mean, they probably didn't even have mirrors. The only thing, the closest thing to it was possibly a stream or a lake or something. But getting back to stained glass, that's been around for a long time. And the images that you see in stained glass are usually images, again, just like those cave walls where you see bison or elk or whatever. Those images are important to the people of the time. They used the tools, the skills that they had to render those images so they could communicate to others in their group what they thought was important. If the others in the group thought that was important, then that would bind or bond the group together. Also, language, writing, that sort of thing is relatively new compared to how we communicate with each other in terms of there's been a lot of illiteracy in humanity for a long time, whether it was politically motivated or just access was denied because people had to survive and work for a living. So images, though, are, since they're universal, since every human on the planet understands it on some level, that was the strongest way to communicate those ideas through images. Obviously, during the time that the artwork is made, it can be very biased culturally because of the time that it's made and all of that. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at new imagery for your church. The church imagery is of the time and of the time that it was created, actually. When you look at the older windows upstairs in the sanctuary and you see figurative work in there, it's predominantly Caucasian people, white people in those images, because in the early 20th century, that was basically how our culture was viewed. And it wasn't their fault. They weren't knowingly racist or anything like that. It was just artists and people who view art expect to do a certain thing to represent their time. Actually, all artists are charged with the job of being a mirror of society and culture. And so artists and intellectuals are usually the ones that are killed first in a communist or autocratic takeover, because they have those insights and they are supposedly less biased. Hopefully they are. So when you look at your windows in this church, it's just a record of the time that they were created. And it's not necessarily good or bad in any way, but we have a new time now. We're in a different time. How do we want to be remembered? This is, getting back to what Ingrid said, will it last forever? Will it be universal? The imagery is universal in the sense that everybody understands it and everybody sees it, but our sensibilities change. And so as our sensibilities change as a culture and a species, the imagery changes. So it's sort of transient in that way. And maybe you want to think of the transient quality of the stained glass itself. When you use stained glass, you're using lead channels to hold the pieces of glass together. And that's something that they invented 1,000 years ago, right around 980 AD, give or take 100 years over in England. It's an early Saxon art form. So when you make a window, the lead in there is the kind of the wild card. Lead is only designed to really work in a window. Its lifespan is about 120 years. Lead is a very strange metal. It's been used because of its ease of use. That's why stained glass artists have hung on to it so long, but it's got a lot of inherent problems. So those problems limit the lifespan of a window unless you've got, endless funds and you're constantly, and I mean, every century you're constantly redoing the lead, the windows will fail and not last forever. So, and it's sort of interesting too, and as I think about it, that century turnaround for the refurbishment of the windows is about as long as that particular iconography or imagery may be relevant to that culture. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of coincides. Stained glass, or again, lead in the stained glass, it expands more when it's heated and it contracts the least amount when it's cooled. Excuse me, when it's cooled. And so this huge expansion rate when it's heated and little contraction rate when it's cold, when it cools, is what makes a window bow out and what makes it fail eventually over the course of time. Middle Ages type stained glass windows, they found, archaeologists have dug some up and tested some of the things that are still intact with those windows and found that the old lead from 500 years ago actually had a longer lifespan than our modern lead does. And it was because they couldn't purify the lead as well as we can today. So the purer the lead, the less stable it actually is. It seemed like it was more stable and had a lot of junk mixed in with that lead chemically. But anyway, so when you look at your windows here, you could look at them in a couple of different ways. You could look at them as a record of the times that they were made and use the stories that are in them. Again, the visual sort of superseded the text form of the story. A lot of people couldn't read the Bible, even though they would go to church. And so the visual would help them understand whatever story that you were trying to get across to the group. And it would be, sometimes it connects with a person emotionally even stronger than the words would. So that was always important. It's an important feature. So you could look at the stained glass windows in a couple of different ways. You could look at them as just telling a story. They were created in a certain period of time. But if their imagery now is found to be not within the sensibilities, the tolerance of the sensibilities of the culture that they're in, then people start thinking about changing them. And so we've actually been approached, our stained glass shop has been approached a few times from churches within the area, trying to figure out how they could reuse their windows, but just not have all these white people in there, because that doesn't reflect really what our reality that we see on a day-to-day basis is. When we go out to Target, we see a lot of people from a lot of different cultures, and sometimes this imagery doesn't reflect that. It can also be, you can also blame the media too. The media is still kind of behind the times in that, although they're trying to catch up a little bit. So you have to decide how you want to communicate these stories to your congregation, what's important, how sensitive you want to be to some people's feelings about that. Are these images still relevant in terms of telling a story, or are they outmoded and you need to have something else to update to make it more relevant to a broader spectrum of people? So I think that's kind of where stained glass is where it comes from and where it's going. It came out of the arts, so painting and drawing. You see a lot of painting in stained glass. It's actually technically, they call it painting, but technically from an artist's perspective, and I'm an oil painter, you look at the painting and it's not actually painting, it's just really drawing on colored glass. So it's black lines with black shading on colored glass, but a skillful artist can give the illusion of shaded color. So, so you have to decide how you want to present your stories, because that's what these really are. These are stories. You should be able to understand the story behind them without being able to read actually, and that's kind of the beauty of it. And they're probably some of the first real graphic design in terms of advertisement. So there's a difference between graphic design and fine art, not trying to sound elitist. Fine art is really a person describing something, a subject matter that's extremely personal to them, that they know a lot about. And I've found in my own work, in my own painting, that there's a point where when you become so honest and so personal, it gets focused to that level, to a point where it sort of flips, and then now it becomes universal. Everybody can understand it. And then because for a long time after I was out of undergrad and graduate school, I was hesitant painting personal imagery. I thought, boy, everybody's going to just psychoanalyze me, and but I found though that the more successful paintings, the paintings with the imagery that spoke to people on a deeper level, were the more personal images that I created. Graphic design, on the other hand, they use the same visual vocabulary. So that's, again, lines and colors and shapes and movement through space, but they use it in the exact opposite way. So fine artists draws you into the imagery. You hover around in there and you absorb things in that artwork, and you understand it, you enjoy it. It may give you emotional responses. Whereas, and then you'll walk away and then come back another day and see things that you hadn't seen before. Graphic arts, which this kind of is, stained glass in a church setting. Graphic arts is more of an advertisement, like if you think of a Coca-Cola advertisement. You want to use all the same principles of line and color and shape, but you want to draw the person's attention, your audience's attention, into that space very quickly. You want to give them as much information as you can within 10 to 30 seconds, and then that's all there is there for you, and then you walk away. I always tell people that if you're looking to do more of a fine art approach, and I'm not saying that you should in this, because this is a community place and it's something that's more of a storytelling place. But if you had a really good piece of fine art in your home, you bought it when you were 20, you looked at it your whole life, could be a painting, a drawing, a sculpture, whatever. On your deathbed, you would sit up and you'd say, oh, I never noticed that before, and then pass away. So that's kind of how you know that there's a lot involved within the piece. When you look at stained glass windows in this church, it's sort of interesting for me to look at this. When you look at original stained glass from 800 years ago, whatever, it looked more abstract. They weren't maybe as facile when it came to rendering imagery. But the whole piece was created in terms of probably more on with the idea that it was going to be like a painting, like fine art. And so every bit of it was activated with that artist's hand and telling the whole story. Now, when you look at modern stained glass, you'll see remnants of that. You'll see the little figurative pieces within the windows here and upstairs. And I've taken many classes from our shop over here. You guys have been gracious enough to allow us to come through here, and we would look at the leaded windows and critique them in terms of the art of them and how technically that they were made. Because there's a whole level of technical and aesthetic level in terms of how the lead is even soldered. Most people don't realize that. So when you go to Menards and you see that big bump of solder on a line, that's not what you're looking for. That's aesthetically not the right thing. But anyway, excuse me. Looking at these now, it's sort of interesting because you see elements of the previous eras where the figurative work is really well described and you can understand what you're looking at. And then around the figurative sections, you'll see abstract kind of colorful white noise around them. And that's because stained glass still is very expensive, and actually traditionally it's only been available to the wealthiest, and in the beginning that was the church. But now you'll see, since it's expensive and people are trying to keep costs down, that they'll do that. They'll have that small piece in there that's really well rendered, but then you'll have this whole area around there that it's sort of cookie cutter. And you can see that actually when you look at it. Still works well in terms of design, still fine, but you can see that the motivations of how designs have changed. And when you go upstairs, you'll see that beautiful center figurative piece in each window. But then if you just look at that, you'll see that that's the image that was supposed to be most important. But then when you look at everything around it, those pieces could have been mass produced for 1,000 other churches. And then they just plunked the figurative piece in there. Stained glass windows, when we're making stained glass windows that don't have painting on them, they could be, I don't know, $250 a square foot maybe for the labor and materials. As soon as we get into painting though, the painting aspect goes up to $400 to $500 or even more depending on how much detail they want per square foot. So, so you can see there's a big cost differential there. It doesn't really affect the overall imagery so much. You still have the story. It is more of a billboard kind of approach where, and it's effective in a church environment because you want to tell a story. So I think that's very good. It depends on how detailed you want something, how specific you want it, how unique you want your pieces to be, to how involved the design should be. So these designs work well. They're fine. They're good. There's nothing wrong with them. They were done by professional artists and graphics people. So, but you can see if you blocked out the painted parts that these windows literally could have been in 1,000 other churches. So that's something to think about. Your abstract piece upstairs is more unique just because of that. Every inch of it was taken up with the design, and every inch of it was unique in a sense. It could be in other churches, but it's more free flowing and you know, it's just more unique. When you look at these windows, again, there's other ways to think about this. When Tiffany made windows in churches, he was presented with windows in cathedrals, and actually not him alone, people for 1,000 years before him. Since churches were the places that could afford stained glass, because it was sort of state of the art 1,000 years ago. It was like building a laptop back then, even though you can make stained glass windows with relatively low technology. Lead can be taken from the earth and melted and then filtered a little bit and then poured into channels, molds to make channels pretty easily with just the heat of a bonfire. Glass can be made that way too, but even though it's relatively low technology, for 1,000 years ago, it was state of the art. So when they were presented with the designs or ideas to put in churches, they found that there's cathedrals especially, and you see a little bit of that in the architecture here. It's not necessary here, but in cathedrals, when they made windows, they had to make them very vertical so they could have more vertical structure to support the upper part of the building. And so you don't need that now because we've got steel and everything else and more technology, but they still retain some of that idea. So when you have a long, skinny vertical, that presents a little bit of a visual problem because you're wanting to have an area or a place of contemplation and quiet. When you have vertical designs are more active, more energized. And so they had a problem with that. They had just a little bit of a technical problem trying to do that. So what they would do is if you looked at these windows, for instance, in this room, you'll see that there's kind of two sets in each window. Think of that dark center line within those windows as another piece of limestone going through there in a cathedral. Well, what they would do then is they would carry over the design from one pane to the other, so it would allude to a larger, flatter, more square design, which would be more calming and contemplative. That's why horizontal designs are calmer, vertical designs are typically more energetic. So to get around that energetic part, they would design more horizontally within those vertical spaces. And so over here, we've got three windows over here. And if you could picture those separated in thirds with stone, you could have a landscape going through all three, which would break up that sense of singularity from one to the other. And so they did that very, very often. But that's just some of the technical aesthetic parts. In terms of your building, again, it's going to be difficult because there's going to be a lot of different people with a lot of different sensibilities looking at it and deciding what to put in there. You can replace just the flesh parts. The people that made those windows in the old days were called flesh painters. So the best people, the best artists would be the people that would paint those. And then there would be the fabric artists. They would be a little lesser on the hierarchy of the studio. And then finally you have the 14-year-old kids painting the grass blades on the bottom.
So just related to the technical side, and this is a question from the chat, how are pieces of glass colored? And so just, can you say just a word about
Sure.
the technical? It sounds like somebody's painting on them and then something happens.
Yep. Stained glass, they're just sheets of glass and it's basically melted sand. And you start out with either clear sand, you can think of it like this, clear sand or white sand, and you melt it. And as it melts, it becomes molten and you can form it into sheets. What gives it a color though, like the greens and the blues, is in its molten form, whether it's clear or white, the artisan is adding metal oxides or metal salts to that glass. So if you have a really intense blue glass, and you'll say to yourself, that looks like a cobalt blue. Well, cobalt happens to be a metal. And so when you add cobalt to that molten glass, it tints it to that color. So cathedrals for 1,000 years didn't have the advantage of electric lights. So they had to get as much light in as possible. So for 1,000 years, they chose as their material to use the clear-based glass that they added color to. The clear-based glass now is known as cathedral glass. When Tiffany came along, he was an oil painter, much like I am. He was a lot wealthier. On his 18th birthday in 1866, he was gifted $30 million by his family and said, here you go be a painter. So, but anyway, and I was not gifted with that. So anyway, he started doing painting and then started doing the stained glass. I think that he actually understood that he wasn't going to be remembered as the best painter that ever lived, even though he was a very good painter. You can look him up online. You can see what Tiffany's paintings look like. Louis Comfort Tiffany. So he decided to do stained glass because, and much in the same way that we did, we understood design and color and how to make things work visually. So, and so he decided to do that. But then he and John Lafarge, another wealthy painter, gone stained glass artist, and Lafarge has actually got some paintings in our Capitol building. they got together and they said, you know, I'm not really feeling it for this clear stuff. And then with the clear, to get detail, you'd have to use that black paint and then do lines and then shade over a colored piece. That's how the fabric is done. So when you look at the fabric on Jesus's robes, it's one color glass with black lines and shading on top of it. So they didn't really like that a whole lot. So they thought, well, let's go back and look at that white-based glass, which is referred to as opalescent glass. And let's take a look at that and see if there's something we can do with that for stained glass, since you know, they were oil painters. And as an aside, that's how all art evolves, is when an artist learns his trade, gets really good at it, and then says, yeah, but I think I'd like to change it a little bit. And so as soon as the artist changes it, that's what makes all art evolve. That's what makes all art change. So they talked about it and they thought, well, let's use some of this opalescent glass, white-based glass, white sand that they're melting, and add different colors to it. And what they did was they came up with a way to start out with white molten glass, and before well, actually, they would squeeze it out with a roller on a bed, and there would be a couple other people putting dollops of, oh, I've got it backwards, sorry. They would start, before they rolled it out, they would have dollops of, a large dollop of white, and then put dollops of color on top of it, just as if you were baking or something. And then they'd have another person with tongs that would just mix those colors a specific amount of times. And that's how they knew what kind of color they were going to get. And they would run it under the roller. And since they didn't stir it up completely, it was like a marble cake. So it'd come out streaky. That way, the artist who was going to render an image in the window could select tiny little parts of how it was blended and streaky that would work in terms of you know, if you're doing a rose, let's say, and they could render it. They could make it go from light to dark in one little piece. They could make it even go from warm red to a cool red in one little piece, just because they didn't mix it thoroughly. So that gave a whole new way of rendering an image more like a painting. So literally, they are painting in glass, not on it. So then they just relegated the painting part to faces and hands. I'm pretty sure that when, you know, I don't know this for a fact, it's my own theory, but I think John Lafarge and Tiffany, being oil painters, looked at how they painted faces and hands and stuff and fabric and thought, that's not even painting. That's like baby painting. That's like that's just drawing, you know, and I'm not gonna, you know, give up, you know, 5 years of my education learning how to use color and render with color, you know, just to paint with lines again. So I think that they decided that was their motivation to do that. They got a patent for it. They sued people for using it. Then they came up with the copper foil technique, and that was another way to get more detail in terms of line quality. When you're an artist, you're trained for the first few years of your career in school to learn how to change the line weight or thickness of the line. That helps to show the rendering, the spatial aspect of that piece. So the darker it is, the farther away the line is from a light source, or the darker it is, the farther back in space it would go. So they use copper foil then. They put copper tape around the edges of the glass and then changed the width between the glasses and just filled it with solder. So that's how they got that line quality that you would get if you were literally drawing with a pencil or a brush. So Tiffany and Lafarge came up with two really important innovations, and actually it's about the most innovation that's been around. I mean, people use those plus their own take on things to be more innovative, but there hasn't been a lot of technical innovation since then. They're making the leads purer with less lead in them. They're using more tin in the leads so that it's more ecologically sound. 1998, the EPA told us as a business that we would be hearing about no lead of any kind in any of the materials that we're using, but there's still lead in them. Lead is very safe, but you have to understand the hazards. And so when we teach classes, we tell people about those hazards. We've had women who are pregnant take those classes. Their doctors would talk to them about how to be safe with that. And lead doesn't transfer through the protein layer of your skin, so you don't have to worry about toxicity there. It's eating it, inhaling it, that kind of thing. So, yeah, and if people have questions about imagery or iconography, iconography is another way of saying these are images of our culture. These are images that we want to perpetuate, and these are images that we want future generations to see. Yeah, go ahead.
I think I know the answer to this question, but ask it anyway. But we assume that mosaic tiling preceded the stained glass.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, yeah.
So could you repeat the
Yeah.
question just so people can hear?
Right. Mosaic tiling preceded as an art form, preceded stained glass. And I think that they're really closely related, because I think that to begin with, tiling was ceramic, but they could also just melt globs of sand. Glass is a whole nother thing that could be talked about in another book, you know, a whole course, because glass has been discovered and forgotten about in cultures over tens of thousands of years. But anyway, tiling was something that they could do with bits of colored anything, colored stones, colored ceramic, and then finally with glass. And so glass, or stained glass, started out sort of as a mosaic, being leaded together because they didn't have ways of making large sheets of glass. So in a sense, you're looking at a mosaic that's transparent when you're looking at stained glass. So they're very, very closely related. Yeah.
To change the skin tone on our images that we have here, and stained glass being painted, and that skin tone we change with paint on glass is hard.
No. Okay. Can the skin tones in the current stained glass be changed in color with modern techniques? It's a yes and no answer. The paint, the lines, and actually there are colored paints now, but typically if you're looking at the 1,000-year-old tradition, there's only basically a handful of colors of black, brown, green, tints of that. Now you can get really bright colors, but back for the last 1,000 years, and traditionally people just are painting with black and white. So it's the color of the glass underneath the paint that gives the illusion of the color of the image. And then that paint is a mixture of ground glass and pigment. And so you paint it on the surface of the glass before it's in the window. You put it in a kiln, something like what you'd use to fire a pot if you were doing ceramics, and you heat it up to about 1,220 degrees. So you can't do that while the window is together. You have to totally disassemble it. Then you could change certain aspects about it. The color is not one of them, really. And by the time you go through all that trouble, it'd probably be easier just to take the flesh parts out if that's all you wanted to change, and redo those and change those. Because basically human anatomy is roughly the same from any kind of person from any place on the planet, really. We have certain proportions, and that's, you know, just how it is, because we're all the same species. So, but you have to ask yourself, is this 1950s imagery with an updated ethnic look, is that going to be relevant? Is that what we want? Do you want that? Do you want to rethink the whole thing? You could still make it look very, very traditional, but you could update it subtly in other ways. Go ahead.
Thinking about the health of the window, you mentioned the lead over time rolling stuff. Does the glass get damaged over time or weaken or compromised?
No, glass is very durable. Glass really doesn't react with almost anything. The problem with glass in the past century or two is that our atmosphere is becoming more acidic. So that's attacking the glass on the outside. So you'll see, it's sort of like when your dishes go in the dishwasher too often and they get that little iridized look on the surface. That's what's happening to the outside of some of the glass of stained glass. Go ahead.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
To the question of changing the shading. As an artist yourself, how would you view having a work of art being altered?
Well, Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, how would I view a piece of art being altered from the perspective of an artist if we were to do that? Well, probably those pieces weren't done by one person. It was probably done by a committee and probably done, like I said, in a studio situation of a hierarchy where you had people that would do the flesh parts, then other people would do the clothing and that kind of thing. So if it were my own painting, I would say, no, of course not. You can't touch that because that was a record of how I perceived the world at that moment in my life in the time of our humanity that I made it. Whereas this is not exactly that. Even a Tiffany window is not that. Tiffany only had ultimate approval or disapproval of his imagery and how they were rendered. He didn't actually, I heard that he only made 3 actual windows, stained glass windows himself. And then I think he figured, oh, okay, I got this. And he went out with his $30 million in 1866 or whenever and hired 250 of the best artisans that he could find to make his windows. So in terms of that, that's not, I don't think that's really an issue. It's just that with an update, it just might not look right. It might not have a good cohesive feel to it because now you're mixing attitudes. Again, it's not something that you verbally articulate. It's something that you feel, something that you attach to emotionally. And as you look at an image, you're going to say, oh, yeah, I like how it's all done, but really? Well, there's something odd there. You won't be able to articulate it, but it might be that you're responding to, you know, if these windows were done in 1950, you're responding to all the 1950 sensitivity, and then all of a sudden you've got 2022 faces in there. It's kind of funny. We did a Jesus and the Archangel. I think so. Anyway, we did those to replace burned windows that were destroyed in a fire in a hermitage in Wisconsin. And I had done, she wanted a Jesus that looked very traditional. So I basically found a really good Jesus pose and face that I think it was done by Tiffany Studios or something. So I pretty much copied it and rendered it and changed a little bit, but showed it to her. And this woman in the hermitage, and she did not like Jesus because he was too serious, she thought. And so I had to take his face out and repaint it, just like I was describing. And I gave him kind of a grin. And then she loved it. So, but it looked terrible. So it was like the good Jesus, you know, the happy Jesus. So, so that was an example to me of how if you mixed sensibilities within one piece, it doesn't really work. So you have to really be cautious of just picking out parts and changing them, you know. So you have to realize where it came from and where you want it to go. All right. So there we go.
I'm going to take over for just a couple seconds.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And here's Ingrid. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, John. We could spend out a week with you learning more about stained glass, and maybe we will over the course of time. So join us next week and actually the following 3 weeks for the ongoing series. If you have questions that are just stirring in your brain that we didn't get to today, please put them on your sheets of paper, and you could just set them up here, and we'll try to make sure that those get addressed in the weeks to come. And what else do I need to say? Am I forgetting anything, Randy or Mike? Am I forgetting anything? Okay, thanks again, John. I'm so grateful for your presentation.
Yeah.